Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson, published in March of 2014, Book 2 of the Stormlight Archive. Kaladin Stormblessed, having discovered his gifts with Stormlight, has risen from slave and bridgeman to captain of the Kholin royal family's personal bodyguard. As noblewoman turned scholar, turned thief, turned herald of the apocalypse, Shallan Davar speeds to the Shattered Plains to deliver information of grave importance. The war between the Alethi and Parshendi escalates towards seeming conclusion. Battles, scheming, assassination plots, and the re-emergence of magics thought long vanished intertwine, and the Everstorm approaches. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the book club, where I join you, as once promised, about a year later, about a year older, maybe not a year wiser, but I do what I can to review Book 2 of the Stormlight Archive, Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson. So I'll just cut to the chase and say first thing that I thought this book was excellent. To prove what I mean, this book is just a hair over 1,300 pages long. I posted my last book club review of Legend by David Gemmell on February 20th, and then I started Words of Radiance, and I wrapped it up about 35 or so days later, or around March 25th, something like that. Now, maybe for some of the ultimate giant brain readers out there, that's a normal reading pace for a 1,300 page book, but for me, that is not. That is exceptionally fast, which I say not to be like, oh, I'm the fast reading genius of here in town. I say that to show how many pages I was inhaling per sitting. I was quite involved in it. You know, there'd be a day or two where I don't read anything, as I think is true for anyone. But then there would be days I would sit down and read, 40, 50, 80, I think in one case over 100 pages a sitting. So I was very involved in this, and it drove me through it with great speed, which is to its credit and a point of praise. Now, all that said, it's not perfect, of course, as I don't think any author could extend perfection for 1,300 pages, but it is generally excellent, and I'll go into why. But just to briefly recap what I discussed about a year ago in my review of the first Stormlight Archives book, The Way of Kings, which, again, I will be spoiling heavily, so, opt out now if somehow you stumbled into this by accident. But this series takes place largely in and around the Shattered Plains, a rocky and windswept land of cliffs and chasms and giant crustacean-based monsters and beasts of burden, where the Alethi people wage war of vengeance against the Parshendi, who assassinated their nation's king 6 years earlier. This war has devolved over time from one of purpose and vengeance into basically just a war of attrition, less about revenge and any greater cause, and now more about fighting over the valuable gem hearts of the Shattered Plains. Think of it as like if you started a new job you were really passionate about and wanted to do great deeds and save the world, and a few years later you're just in it to punch in and out and get a paycheck. That's what this whole vengeance war is, and has kind of devolved into. Into this, at the beginning of The Way of Kings, entered Kaladin, a 20-year-old surgeon turned spearman turned bridge-bearing slave who, through the course of the first book, united his fellow slaves of Bridge 4 into a noble fighting force, who, at the end of the book, the Alethi High Prince and brother of the murdered king, Dalinar Kholin, purchased from the evil High Prince Sadeas for the price of a legendary shard blade, and made into his own family's personal bodyguard. The story of Words of Radiance picks up nearly instantly from the end of The Way of Kings. I'm not sure exactly, but I think possibly within the same week of Kaladin being freed. So it's not a, we pick up years later sequel by any means at all. The settings of the original novel, however, outside of Shallan in the library, thankfully, And some of the interludes continue on with the Shattered Plains, war against the Parshendi, scheming amidst the Alethi High Princes, and so on. Certain elements are heavily de-emphasized from the original, however, which I think is certainly a good thing, as to make it not feel like, just a straight-up retelling. There are far fewer war scenes between the Alethi and the Parshendi forces. There are some, but I mean, it's a sharp reduction, and even sharper is the reduction in bridge-bearing slave sequences, with Bridge 4 for the obvious reason that our core group of bridgemen and other groups as well, not just Bridge 4, are no longer slaves or bridgemen at all, though they continue to use the name Bridge 4 as a kind of a name for their whole unit, which is nice to see them kind of coalescing around their former terror and trauma. But yeah, the lack of the bridge scenes and the war scenes relatively it's a huge change right off the bat, because I feel like the bridge carrying and subsequent war chapters, they must have made up, I don't know, a fifth maybe of all the cumulative page count in the last book. Maybe more, maybe a quarter. So yeah, this is a huge change right off the bat. Also heavily de-emphasized, I would say here, are Dalinar Kholon's kind of a god-sent visions. He still has them a lot, but we don't see them so much. And in the first book, those did a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of kind of the mythology, the world building, the lore, the backstory, but they aren't entirely absent here. But like the war and bridge-bearing sequences, I'd say they're brought down by a good 80% or so. What kind of steps in to fill the gap page count-wise and expand the page count, I guess, because this is even longer than the first book, is Shallan's story, Shallan Davar, which, I might have groaned if you told me that after book 1, but it turns out what I kind of found tedious about Shallan in The Way of Kings wasn't so much Shallan herself as that damn library. I'm not even saying the library was a bad setting. I mean, hell, if I was in this world, I would sure as hell prefer to spend my time in that library over the Shattered Plains. But, that's kind of the problem, I guess. I'd prefer to live in my apartment to Westeros, but that doesn't mean life in my apartment would be more exciting to read about, does it? But now Shallan is on the move by sea and land with her mentor, Jasna Kholon, to deliver the message that the Parshman slaves and servants will rise up as Voidbringers to the Shattered Plains. It's kind of a weird message to deliver if you think about it, like, hey, that race we're fighting and have been fighting for years? It turns out that we're really fighting them. It's serious. Our enemy is really our enemy. But, if it gets Shallan on the move, I approve. And on the move she is, picking up the beginning of the book on a ship on her way to the Frostlands to move north to the Shattered Plains. And, minor spoiler alert here about the direction the story goes. A few hundred pages in, so, skip ahead 10 seconds if you don't want to know. But the one that's a big goddamn relief is that she finally links up with other main characters on the Shattered Plains. Shallan does not spend the entirety of Book 2 in a quarantine, timely reference there, as she did Book 1. And there are new characters in Shallan's story too, some of whom only play a relatively minor role, but one major one is she now has a sidekick, just like Kaladin. Kaladin had a Spren sidekick in the first book, Spren being these kind of elemental fairy type things that occupy this world. But Kaladin had a sidekick from the first book in the not quite a wind spren, but kind of acting like or disguised as a wind spren, Syl. Now Shallan gets her own spren sidekick in the form of Pattern. He's sort of this jumbled mass of symbols and letters and numbers, I guess, who kind of moves along the floor, sort of looking flat. And he actually has kind of a character arc of his own. Pattern, through the course of this book, gradually overcomes what I can only think to call severe autism. He learns at first he's kind of mindless, and he just climbs up and down walls and falls off. But then he learns a few words, and then he learns how human language works, and then human thought and expressions, and he learns about lying and scheming and ambitions and whatnot, and how to help make plans with Shallan. He also has the ability to speak in the voices of other people, which Shallan kind of uses for subterfuge and diversion and all kinds of roguish fun stuff. I really liked the pattern Shallan dynamic, and I think it kind of spruces up her character in a good way, kind of like the way Syl did for Kaladin. And I have to say that it's actually great seeing scenes with Shallan and Kaladin and the Kholin boys together. In retrospect, thinking about it now, kind of reading this book and other books I've read in recent years, I had to say that I'm not quite sure about the Song of Ice and Fire's approach of waiting literally thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pages extended across decades of book publishing before we ever get to see main characters we would like to see interact. So now book 2, we finally see some main characters interact, and it's great. At a certain point, I think it's time to bring things together, and Brandon Sanderson in this book does so at, I think, the right point. Shallan and Kaladin's dynamic is immediately fun and an immediate new favorite of mine. Kind of initial squabbling, kind of turning to respect, as I think you would kind of expect, but well done. The light eyes, dark eyes dynamic between the two, kind of the warrior versus scholar dynamic, they kind of get into it at first, but respect blooms, and I very much enjoyed the dynamic of those two characters. And in fact, I think I like Kaladin's dynamics with everyone. Dalinar's son Adolin Kholin at first in kind of the first book, and to some extent in this one, kind of comes across as sort of the high school villain jock from an 80s movie, kind of gradually turned to good. He's kind of smug, arrogant, vain, wealthy. He's taken by himself, by his own skills and his own appearance, and I guess you could even kind of say he's sort of racist in the light eyes, dark eyes dynamic kind of way. He's very aware of who's the dark eyes, and he does kind of regard them inherently as below his station. But that said, the tension this creates with Kaladin, as with Kaladin and Shallan, makes for a great little dynamic. Every scene that Adolin and Kaladin have together, the way they kind of poke at each other, it's always fun through the whole book. Never got bored of it, straight through from beginning to end. And it's great to see the trust that Dalinar has in Kaladin in this book, because we know that Kaladin, from reading The Way of Kings, that Kaladin earned that respect the hard, grueling way, with his goddamn blood and his goddamn sweat and his goddamn tears. So I'm almost glad there wasn't more conflict than there is in the Kaladin-Dalinar dynamic, because I think Kaladin deserves a little bit of a break, I guess, frankly. So I would almost divide this book, Words of Radiance, up into 3 kind of sections, 3 acts, and I know the book divides itself into 5 parts right there in the text. Part 1, you read a while, you get to part 2, and so on. But it does sort of feel like a 3-act structure to me. Act 1 involves kind of getting Shallan to the Shattered Plains, and kind of some Alethi high prince scheming, a few of the kind of classic war scenes from the first book, and Kaladin kind of growing into his new role as a royal bodyguard, and feeling out kind of his Stormlight powers a little bit. We'll get back to Act 2 in a second, because that's actually kind of what I'm getting at and want to discuss here. But then Act 3, kind of we move up to a final battle of sorts, and final reveals about the city tower of Irithiru. I hope I didn't butcher that pronunciation. According to Brandon Sanderson, I'm sure I did. But which I'll discuss that kind of the end, Act 3, more in my spoiler section at the end. But that second act I mentioned, I kind of wanted to discuss now a little bit, because I was talking about Kaladin and Adolin, and they seem sort of the focus of this middle act of the book, Act 2, which the core of it is kind of duels. Duels over shard blades and shard plate. Specifically in Adolin, kind of arranging these duels, kind of scheming to get people into duels, engaging, fighting other Alethi nobility for their shard blades and shard plate. Both for the most literal cause of amassing, an arsenal of all-powerful holy weapons and armor for the upcoming war, but also to kind of impress other high princes, make alliances, kind of try to maneuver as much of the nobility as he can to unite behind the Kholins and Dalinar and Adolin, rather than behind Sadeas. And there's plenty of fun stuff in this whole section of the book because ultimately I'm a simple man and a simple reader. And when I sit down to read a fantasy book, I want to read sword fights, and a lot of them. And here there are a lot of sword fights, a lot of damn sword fights. And I'll have to kind of discuss the climactic scene of this whole act of the book that occurs about 2/3 of the way through the novel in my spoiler section, because it definitely is a spoiler. But I will just kind of hint at it and say that this whole kind of dueling subplot culminates in about a 20-25 or so page action scene that, well, relatively low stakes in terms of the number of lives at risk compared to kind of the more true climax of the book, is actually my favorite kind of sequence of the entire novel, and had me just flipping through the pages like a madman. Just really cool stuff that kind of totally legitimized this whole dueling subplot that when it started way back in the Way of Kings, I wasn't quite sure where it was, where it was moving towards and what it was building up to. But seeing it, I think, yeah, that was worthwhile. That was very enjoyable. But all that said, while I did, very much enjoy the dueling subplot and the big action scene that it all escalates into, I do think it feeds into maybe kind of a problem I have with Words of Radiance, and which is perhaps I would say the cheapening of shard blades and maybe a general power level creep. And I'll explain what I mean. So in book 1, I consistently got the impression that shard blades were this holy, legendary, almighty magical weapons, just on par with something like the rings of power in the Lord of the Rings in Middle-earth, or the pieces of the Triforce in the Legend of Zelda. Just something that were, put in real-world monetary standards, were the equivalent of something worth, billions of dollars. Just having a shard blade was an incredible status symbol and a game changer in war. Just something that made men into legends. But here in Words of Radiance, shard blades become kind of cheap and almost a common feeling. Like single characters are literally amassing arsenals of shard blades, like getting 5, 6 shard blades. Shard blades are getting swapped around willy-nilly. People are giving them away. People are giving them away for free to common soldiers, to characters so minor they don't really even qualify as tertiary characters, become like shard bearers. There's one scene in which a character literally chucks a shard blade out of a window to hide it. So I feel like it all kind of serves to undermine how badass and holy and legendary these weapons are supposed to be. Like, everyone has a shard blade. If you don't have a shard blade, you're a complete loser, Even Shallan has one. And why was she spending a year trying to steal this soul caster or whatever in the Way of Kings to get her family out of debt? Why didn't she just sell her shard blade? So, I don't know. Maybe I misinterpreted something when I was reading The Way of Kings. Maybe owning a shard blade is more like owning a really big gun, and it's not that big a deal. But reading this book, yeah, shard blades definitely didn't play as special as I kind of thought they were going into The Way of Kings. And even putting aside shard blades themselves, there is kind of a general power level creep going on. Like maybe not even a creep, maybe a leap into oblivion. Like, without going into specifics, because it is kind of end game stuff, I don't want to spoil the end of the book or anything, but things escalate into basically a borderline Dragon Ball Z fight toward the end of the book. And while it's without a doubt, it is epic. It is big scale epic stuff and entertaining to read, very well written by Sanderson. It's I think maybe it arguably feels like a little too much too soon. Like maybe this is something we should have saved for book 3, arguably even book 4, but yeah, it's here where we get some real like high level magic powers in this book, stuff way beyond anything you see in Lord of the Rings or anything like that. Way beyond it, like legitimate superpowers. And hell, as long as we're doing complaints, let's just kind of get the complaints out of the way. I'll just also toss in here that a character I can say who it is. It's Kaladin. Makes a decision later on in the book and trusts someone in a way that was not just dumb in like a believable sense, but so dumb that it actually felt kind of out of character. Like it's like it was running away from the slasher in an 80s horror movie up the stairs to where you're trapped, level dumb, to a way I couldn't even quite take it seriously as a reader. I'll have to go more into the specifics and spoilers, but yeah, Kaladin does something I couldn't buy dramatically partway through the book, and it is a little bit of a problem for me. But having done all those complaints, like I said up top, I did think this book was excellent. It did a fine job doing what I think epic fantasy literature at its very best can do, which is doing a perfect kind of balancing act between character study, character development, entertaining character dynamics between, different characters, mixed with kind of an epic world-saving and or world-ending stakes and a huge plot with a huge-scale action scenes when called for. Most of my favorite little bits involve kind of the mix of action with kind of the character interactions of characters who usually didn't interact much in the first book, kind of coming together with dramatic stakes, often coming to each other's rescue. Now, I mentioned in my first review of The Way of Kings last year that the war between the Alethi and the Parshendi in the Shattered Plains kind of felt intentionally reflectory of real-world wars in the Middle East and such, with kind of an initial war of revenge devolving into just being stuck in this eternal, entrenched military conflict with no particular end game and no real big bad to go up against. Just lives being thrown into the meat grinder, lost in endless skirmishes over the same bits of land, going back and forth and over again. Just bloodshed without morality, without cause, without end. And I said last year when I reviewed The Way of Kings that I liked that as a message because I feel that it is sadly and eternally irrelevant. Has been since before I was born, probably, if I'm being honest, whatever we try to do in the real world probably will be until I die, hopefully of old age. But that said, this book is admittedly different in that sense, and I think takes things in a different direction. Events kind of are building down toward a countdown of sorts, the Everstorm, with a more save the world type stakes and kind of a minor kind of Lord of the Rings type sense, and the war against the Parshendi is kind of pushed into their territory and escalates into a more traditional final battle. What's a kind of untraditional, I guess, about it in the high fantasy sense is that it's more our heroes kind of escalating things as we get toward the final act of this book. It's more our heroes amassing literal power in the form of, shard blades and bigger armies, and Kaladin uncovering his Stormlight powers. And it's kind of more our heroes, Dalinar, who's kind of taking the fight into Parshendi territory at the end of the book, which is a little unusual. Usually in fantasy, it's antagonists who are the aggressors, territory-wise, isn't it? Think of Sauron coming to Gondor, the Death Star going to blow up the Rebels' base, so on and so forth. So we have kind of a reversal of things here, I suppose, which is kind of interesting. But I said in my review of The Way of Kings last year that I was kind of hoping we didn't get kind of a main Parshendi villain to kind of help emphasize the moral points it felt like the book was making. But with kind of the stakes kind of changing a little bit to the Everstorm and more of a save the world thing here, we actually do kind of get a Parshendi big bad. I don't want to say a Parshendi Dark Lord because that's it's not that morally simple, but I didn't mind, and I'll explain why. So we do get a kind of main Parshendi villain in the form of Ashonai, who it turns out is the identity of the shard bearer that Dalinar fought near the end of book 1 to kind of a stalemate. Or actually, I think it kind of seemed like Ashonai was winning, didn't it? Till Dalinar retreated. So we see Parshendi society and Parshendi cities now, and we see Ashonai begin to consolidate her power over her fellow Parshendi, or listeners, as they call themselves, in kind of increasingly violent and authoritarian ways. Shonai isn't. You can't really say that she's a hero from a certain point of view, because really I don't think she is. She begins formulating increasingly kind of violent and desperate and scorched earth plans against the Alethi. Plans that will call on the kind of deep magics of the world and the high storms in truly kind of world-rending and apocalyptic ways. But even so, Shonai, she's not Palpatine, she's not Sauron. There are enough moral complexities to keep things interesting. For one, this isn't like the orcs, where they all blindly serve the Dark Lord. No, there are many Parshendi folk who are against Shonai's ways and against her becoming a leader, and who she kind of brutalizes in basically like death camp scenarios in ways worse than anything she does to the humans. And, also, even as the Parshendi become a more intimidating enemy, we kind of see more of their culture, which Sanderson has obviously spent a lot of time like elaborately designing. I couldn't even go into it all like really quickly here. You could do a whole lore video easily about all the Parshendi rhythms and forms, as it were, but I'll just say they have this society that's sort of based on these songs and rhythms and transforming into different sorts of beings to fit different sorts of situations. It's all quite interesting, quite elaborate, and I wouldn't even claim that I understand it all quite at this point, because there was a lot of information to take in all at once. But it does paint a portrait of an interesting and in their own way noble people who you wouldn't want to see get wiped out, and who even as they are kind of our antagonists from a certain point of view, you can easily understand their viewpoint and motivation, which is basically not to get genocided by humans. And I think that's a pretty goddamn worthwhile and understandable motivation. The Shonai chapters are part of the kind of interlude chapters that take place between the 5 parts of the book that I mentioned. And like in the Way of Kings, there are interlude chapters that I frankly found kind of annoying and didn't really understand what they had to do with anything and could have lived without. There's even some in that category that I did think were well-written short stories by Sanderson, and I might have enjoyed them as short stories, like this one with these merchants on the back of this giant living island beast. But that when I was reading, I was like, oh my god, can we get back to Kaladin and Shallan and stuff that has stuff to do with the story? But on the other side, I did very much enjoy the interlude chapters that kind of gave us the kind of the antagonistic points of view, namely Shonai, like I just mentioned, and King Taravangian, I think you pronounce his name, in Carbranth. And maybe even I think that Sadeas's chapters, as there's only a few of them, should have been moved to the interlude sections. I feel like maybe they would have made more sense there than where they actually are in the book. But, any skepticism I initially had reading Shonai's chapters and being like, where is this going? It had melted away by the end of the novel, and I had definitely come to value her chapters and her point of view, and would like to see more in the next book. Overall, though, like I said in my Way of Kings review, it was Kaladin whose chapters I liked the most. His chapters in Words of Radiance definitely didn't have the same pure drama and the desperation that they did in the Way of Kings, because he's not a slave anymore. He's not carrying that bridge anymore into war zones without armor. He's not starving anymore, and, well, he's starting to get some superpowers. His interactions with the other lead characters I enjoyed very much, and there wasn't a single action scene he ended up in the entire novel that didn't have me sailing through the pages at a good clip. And this extends to the other bridgemen too, by the way. It's nice how they continue to call themselves Bridge 4. I like that. It's this great little club of survivors of this traumatic incident who continue to love and respect and rely on each other. And of course, every single scene with Rock continues to delight. He's a fantasy tertiary character done right, with a lot of humor. And it's probably the humor in the book that's most effective is anything with Rock. So overall, I enjoyed this book a whole lot. I read 1,300 pages in a month and change, which I will say straight up is pretty rare for me. I do not normally read that fast. And it does a really good job of moving the plot, the characters and the world of this saga forward. And as of the end of this book, I honestly, I couldn't even speculate what we're heading into in book 3. It seems like we've resolved a whole lot as of the end of this book from what was introduced early on in The Way of Kings, which is good. If we didn't resolve a whole lot in nearly a quarter of 10,000 pages, that would probably be a little lame. But yeah, let's go ahead and move on into spoilers, where I have more good stuff to say and a few more gripes too. Getting into a few details that I kind of alluded to earlier, but didn't quite get all the way into the spoilers. First off, for me, the most kick-ass scene in this entire book, maybe almost in this entire saga so far, give or take Kaladin saving Dalinar at the end of The Way of Kings. But my favorite bit in this book, more so than Kaladin saving Elhokar from Moash and Graves, more than any big battle, more than Shallan teleporting everyone at the end, is the 4 versus 1 turned into 4 versus 2 or 2.5. I had a duel between Adolin and Relis's shard bearer henchman that Kaladin joins in on. It starts like a thrilling concept, this 4 versus 1 duel, when Adolin had only expected 2 versus 1, and then once Kaladin jumps in and joins into the fight with his spear without a shard blade against shard bearers, it gets better and better and better. It's the sort of coming together of story elements, the dueling subplot, Kaladin's training against shard bearers in kind of the training circle, Kaladin and Adolin's dynamics and relationship, even Renarin joining in, and even Shallan helping out with pattern, all coming together. It seems like the sort of thing that seems so hard to pull off as a writer and so worth it. Just what a great scene. I was totally digging that. And there's some other really cool scenes I didn't want to get into before officially getting into spoilers. Kaladin and Shallan's whole run through the chasms from chasm fiends and high storms, also a really great sequence, and for a similar reason in the way it kind of culminated a character relationship that had been kind of growing between Kaladin and Shallan up to that point. But speaking of Kaladin saving King Elhokar from Moash, that does kind of get into a problem I have with the book that I alluded to earlier. It was I actually did like Kaladin. We get some moral complexities with Kaladin, with him being tempted by the assassination of Elhokar, and I like that. And even that made sense with Elhokar seeming to be okay with the idea of executing Kaladin for insulting Amaram earlier. But I have to draw a line at the stupidity of Kaladin handing Moash his goddamn shard blade and shard plate after knowing the man to be duplicitous and a planned assassin and whatnot. I just couldn't accept that as in character for Kaladin. It was just a leap too far into stupidity. It was the sort of thing where I could kind of see the Sanderson playing with elements behind the scenes, like trying to work pieces into place to have Kaladin have to fight a shard bearer at the end to save Elhokar, and it just didn't quite convince to me. And hell, on the same line, along the same lines of stuff I just couldn't quite buy, Dalinar still trusting Amaram after Kaladin told him the truth, that also was kind of, it felt off. It's like Dalinar's trusting these two people weaving very different stories at the same time. It wasn't that big of a deal because that story was wrapped up in a few hundred pages, and hopefully, as we can see, won't go on into book 3. So it's not the end of the world. I'm not like, I'm so mad about this, but I'll give that bit kind of a 2. Now let's go into the book's ending. As long as we're talking spoilers. Not so much the climactic sequence of the Alethi versus the Parshendi, while Kaladin and Seth do their best Goku versus Frieza impression in the skies above, and Shallan works the teleporter. All that was over the top to some extent, but it was enjoyable and epic, and I don't have much more to say about it beyond that. It was a good climax to a fantasy novel. But what I do want to talk about is the 3 consecutive kind of ending twists after the climax, one of which I loved, one of which I was maybe a little mixed on, and one of which I didn't like at all. Okay, one the one that I loved, and that is Adeline murdering Sadeas. This was just perfectly dramatically timed, just perfectly. When Sadeas started, explaining and rolling out his plans for what seemed to be his Book 3 schemes, again, how to paint Dalinar as a traitor and a coward and a secret ally of the Parshendi, and, his extended treachery and plots at court, Sadeas just, here's my evil plan, here's my evil monologue for what I'm going to get up to next week on the Stormlight Archive. I felt as exhausted with his shit as Adeline did. It's time to move on from this. This war has escalated. The Everstorm is here. We're into all these magical powers now. There's bigger fish to fry. I don't need Sadeas' scheming and backstabbing anymore. And and then Adeline murdered him. We have plenty of drama without Sadeas, and so it was very well timed to get this subplot out of the way, while also simultaneously giving Adeline more dramatic shading, showing that he's not so noble, perhaps, giving him more internal conflict, and in just the literal external sense of having to hide his role in the murder, giving him an obvious story to go with going into Book 3. So I give a huge thumbs up to this ending twist. I was quite delighted reading it. Now, as for what I was mixed on in the kind of ending sequence, the denouement, as you call it, there was Dalinar pretty much just straight up saying to God or whoever, yo man, I'd like some of them Stormlight superpowers, and God just being like, oh, yeah, that's all right, and giving them to him. It felt a bit like, wow, that was awfully easy. I think I might have preferred it if Dalinar actually was what he had said he thought he was earlier in the book, just the one supposed to gather the new Knights Radiant rather than being a full member. And maybe if we'd ended the book with the club so far, consisting of Kaladin, Shallan, and Renarin. But, oh well, it is what it is. I guess we'll see what happens with Dalinar having some Stormlight mischief going on in Book 3. And finally, that brings us to the ending twist that I kind of didn't like one bit, which actually happens to be the last chapter of the entire book, and that was Jasnah Kholin turning out not to be dead. Kind of hate that, to be honest. Jasnah dying was perfectly good, perfectly useful drama to propel the Shallan's plot forward. Yes, it was sudden. Yes, it was shocking, but in a good way that worked to move story and kind of get rid of a character whose purpose, that being training Shallan and telling the truth of the Voidbringers and whatnot, had mostly been served as of the end of the Way of Kings. But no, we can't let go of her, and she's back. And that means that as of about 2,500 pages into this saga, not a single meaningful good guy character outside of a few relatively minor bridgemen has died. Oh, and I guess Adeline's horse. Poor Sureblood. But yeah, I'll just say straight up that this final Jasnah chapter didn't do it for me. It left me closing the back cover with a little bit of a sour taste in my mouth. But I won't let one little bad bite at the end ruin the entire meal, which in this case was a tasty meal indeed. I'm glad it seems that we're moving on to other settings with Urithiru, I can't say that word, and stuff at the end, and kind of moving on from the Shattered Plains a little bit. And I'm curious to see what Book 3 will, what it'll be about, frankly. I suppose that Ashonai and Zeth are still out there. We got these multiple storm systems now. We got high storms, we got everstorms, we got international upheaval with all these assassinated kings and emperors. And the Parshmen, maybe they'll still take war form or storm form or something all at once and rise up. But there's no super clear direction I can see this taking. No one has a plan to take a one ring to a mountain or anything like that at this point. And if I was to guess what Oathbringer will be about, I'm sure I would just end up looking super dumb. So I won't guess. All I guess is that I will probably have to read the book myself and see. Again, as with the Way of Kings, once I've read some shorter books first as a little bit of a palate cleanser. But yeah, so Words of Radiance, thumbs up. Really cool. Really enjoyed it. High fantasy done right with some traditional tropes in there in terms of they are fighting a war. They do. It escalates into a final battle. There's the magic swords and magic powers, but enough kind of imagination with the settings and interesting characters and strong character dynamics to make it read pretty darn quick for a 1,300-page book. That's not to say it couldn't have been trimmed up a little, but normally if I was to read a book this long, I would say, this could be trimmed to half its length, and not the case here. I'd say that these 1,300 pages are pretty well spent. Give or take maybe an interlude or two I could have done without, but if 1,200 of 1,300 pages are real good stuff, I would call that an impressive victory. So looking forward to book 3. So yep, thanks for hanging out at the book club again, everyone. Read on, and peace out. I'll talk to y'all again probably a little sooner this time. Later.